We're back for your ears only. I'm Melissa Exelberth.
I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news. "Be sure that I did my best to stay." That was graffiti left by one of 1,000 Islamic insurgents retreating from the old city in Homs, initial stronghold of the rebellion against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, under a deal that let them keep their weapons. But later in the week, other insurgents blew up a major hotel in Aleppo, killing at least a dozen of the army troops based there and calling that deal into question. Now this.
We're always told our forces on the Ukrainian border are a concern. We have withdrawn them.
So far, we haven't seen any indications that they are pulling back.
The announcement of a Russian pullback from the Ukraine border, announced by President Vladimir Putin last week in translation, was quickly contradicted by NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, and Putin's equally surprising suggestion to delay an autonomy referendum in eastern Ukraine was, less surprisingly, rejected by passionate pro-Russian separatists there as battles with Ukrainian government forces continue to raise the body count on both sides. But even as Putin paid a victory visit to re-annexed Crimea, he did not order the kind of overt military intervention his foreign minister once threatened and which all of the West still fears.
Just as the Ukraine crisis seemed to demonstrate the inevitable influence of Russia in its own backyard, at least so far, it also reveals the weakness and division of Europeans and the NATO military alliance in which Washington has played such a big role since the end of World War II. To talk about both lessons and related issues, we're joined again by Dr. Sarwar Kashmeri, Adjunct Professor of Political Science at Norwich University in Vermont, a Fellow of the Foreign Policy Association, and author of the book NATO 2.0, Reboot or Delete. Welcome back to the program.
Very glad to be here. Thank you for having me on again.
Putin has not sent troops to protect pro-Russian separatists in their battles with Kiev government forces, despite previous threats. Since he publicly opposed their referendum, do you think he would use that as a pretext for annexation, as happened in Crimea?
Well, I think there's probably a 50-50 chance, but somehow I don't think that Russia will, because I think that the instability that is being generated there by internal forces, probably inspired by Russia, will do the job for him. So unless the West interferes in a much more aggressive manner, I don't think we'll see what we've seen in Crimea.
Well, where do you stand on the call to aid Kiev with heavier U.S. weapons?
Oh, I'm very opposed to it. I think if the Europeans wish to do it, they should go ahead and do it, because, after all, it is in their backyard and therefore in their vital national interests. The United States has no vital interests in Ukraine, and I'm totally against the United States getting involved. In fact, what I should say is I think we need to be very careful about how much we get involved, because sooner or later we will have to walk back, and the more involved we get, the harder that will be.
And what about threats of more comprehensive economic sanctions, which also hurt big Western economic interests? Does national pride permit Putin to defy them endlessly?
Well, I think Putin will, because I think, in fact, beginning with the Georgia invasion roughly 8 years ago, Russia or Putin pretty much laid down the line and said, listen, Georgia and Ukraine are on the border. They're in Russia's vital national interests, and that's where I will fight.
Well, in fact, early on, you compared the situation in Ukraine 2014 with the U.S. invasion of Grenada in 1983, which many Americans may not even remember.
In 1983, Grenada, which is, you recall, about 100 miles southeast of the United States, but is within the American ambit of interest. And there was a coup there, and a Marxist government was brought in, and they invited Cubans, also Marxists, to build an airfield. And the United States decided that this was much too close, and under the containment policy, America sent in the Marines against a small island of about 91,000 people. And so we need to keep in mind that countries are very careful when their vital national interests are involved. And that's what Mr. Reagan did then. That's what Mr. Putin is doing in the Ukraine.
You've also written that continuing crisis in Ukraine is both the best of times and worst of times for NATO. In what ways?
Well, NATO, is a alliance of 28 countries. 26 of them are European. So for NATO to act, all 26 European countries, together with Canada and the U.S., have to vote unanimously. And as you can tell from the last 3 weeks, the European countries are very divided amongst themselves, and the idea that there will be a unanimous vote to go to war or take military action is a real uphill battle, as Libya showed. And secondly, NATO, doesn't have an army. Most people don't know this. It doesn't have a military, an army, navy, air force. Every time there's an action, they have to vote unanimously to take action, and then each one of the alliance members has to contribute forces to take action, forces for which they have to pay. So NATO, A, doesn't have a military, B, doesn't have a budget to run a war, and the idea that 28 countries will today act unanimously to go to war against Russia, to me, is not just incredible. It won't happen.
One correction you suggest is for NATO to stop playing global cop under U.S. direction and focus more on its initial mission of mutual self-defense. But doesn't recent history show that member nations can muster more unity for missions in Afghanistan and Libya than for pushback against Moscow's mostly covert aggression, given all the economic and energy ties to Russia?
Well, that's a very good question and very relevant. I continue to believe that the NATO countries are in Afghanistan to show loyalty to the United States. Most of those countries had no interest in being there. The people were almost unanimously opposed to it. And in fact, when they were there, they had all kinds of conditions on the help that they would give. Some did not want to fight at night. Some didn't want their helicopters to be used by anyone else. Some didn't want to fight at all. For example, Germany in their part of Afghanistan. So in Europe, which is where NATO began, is where NATO should focus. And especially because even today, the European countries, the members of NATO, have as much money as they need to put into NATO. Most people don't know it, but the European nations spend about $280 billion on their defense, which is what the United States used to spend before 9/11. But they do it in a very haphazard way with duplication and so on, because they know that the United States will bail them out and they can spend their money in whatever way they want, counting on America's defense credit card. So if NATO focuses back on Europe, if NATO focuses on a European territorial threat, and America lets Europe take the lead in that, they will want to make their defenses as efficient as possible. And I think that it is time that America should realize it doesn't need to be a leader everywhere, especially not where its richest and closest friends are. And the Europeans should realize that they don't always need American leadership to do what they wish to do.
Dr. Sarwar Kashmeri is adjunct professor of political science at Norwich University in Vermont, a fellow of the Foreign Policy Association, and author of the book NATO 2.0, Reboot or Delete.
Quote from the news, "We must not be fossilized in the past. This was a policy practice decades ago. Mostly." That was Archbishop Tomasi, the Vatican's representative in Geneva, reporting that 848 priests were dismissed between 2004 and 2013, and 2,572 disciplined for sexual abuse and isolated from children.
Next, press freedom and foreign policy, for your ears only.